And I'm going to hand, and then just a couple of housekeeping things, actually, everybody, for those new to these talks. We tend to keep our mics off during the talks. You are welcome to turn your cameras off or on. I think it's lovely to have your camera on, so it makes Lou feel like there's actually people in the call. We will, you're welcome to drop questions in the chat. I will chair or kind of help out with the questions at the end and direct them to Lou if they're written. Otherwise, we can open our mics at the end and ask Lou any questions. But the artist talks are normally about 40 minutes long, and we are audio transcribing so that in terms of accessibility. Over to you, Lou. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
On this cold and wet Tuesday night. I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natasha. Hello, everyone. Hi. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. Yes, here we are. Well, I feel very honoured and privileged to be invited to come here and talk today. Well, I say come here. I'm sitting in my own home, and probably many of you are sitting in yours. Anyway, I'm going to talk about my work for a little while. My work provokes, I'm so sorry, my work makes public things that are normally private and provokes a range of conflicting responses: attraction, repulsion, horror, hilarity, incomprehension, understanding, tears, hugs, rage, laughter, and more. For me, it's a question of balance. The darker side of my sculptural practice and my installation work is balanced by a brighter side of social engagement, performance, and collaboration. One artist whose work and words have influenced me greatly is Christian Boltanski. His work is also definitely on the darker side. For his installation Personne, for example, he uses many tons of second-hand clothing, some in grids and some in an enormous pile. The clothing is lifted and dropped back onto the pile by a mechanical claw, with a backdrop of the sound of multiple heartbeats. If you haven't seen or experienced any of his work, do look him up. Boltanski says that most artists have just one idea. I'm not sure that that is in fact the case, but I do know that there's one theme I return to again and again in my practice, and that's individuation. Carl Jung says that individuation is a process which needs to occur in the second half of life, and it's about finding meaning and purpose. He says it's a form of self-actualization and is ultimately a preparation for death. Jung suggests that individuation involves balancing our multiple selves with the dark side or shadow of ourselves, and maintains that failure to acknowledge and accept this shadow can result in fragmentation and associated mental health issues. Other psychologists suggest that individuation starts from the moment we're born and is about a gradual separation from our parents as we discover our own identity and selfhood. I first discovered Jung's individuation just as I started my art foundation when I was approaching 50. So his definition strongly resonated with me. Of course, individuating effectively as a child and adolescent are equally important. Individuation seems to be a lifetime's quest. But as Natasha was saying, I sometimes say that becoming an artist for me was a form of midlife crisis, albeit a very positive one. Above all, I want my work to be a provocation to thought, conversation, and sometimes action. But what makes people react so strongly, and it's in such contrasting ways, to my work? At the end of my BA in 2015, I was awarded the Embroiderers Guild Scholarship, which included the opportunity to exhibit my work as part of the Embroiderers Guild Graduate Showcase at the Knitting and Stitching shows in London and Harrogate. Both shows were extremely busy, with 14,000 visitors in London alone, and I very quickly realised that if I didn't actively engage with the public, I'd miss an unprecedented opportunity to get valuable feedback. In a gallery setting, the artist might usually only be present for a couple of hours during a private view or when invigilating. In this setting, I was with my work from 10 to 5 for 9 days. My intention was that my sculptures should be provocations, and during this time, it was very clear that I had been successful. Because it was so busy, I began to ask people as we were talking whether I could write down their comments, and so it began. It hadn't been planned, but it became something invaluable to me, documentation of the event and the fabulous range of responses to my work. It felt like such a privilege to be part of these conversations. I met many lovely people and my work received a wonderful range of conflicting responses, much hilarity, some tears and hugs, many inspiring conversations, shared stories, some disapproval, some revulsion, some horror, shock, and incomprehension. I was delighted. These conversations have inspired me to continue researching ways to provoke different kinds of responses through my work, and also to find out why people react to my work in such different ways. I like to call this astonishing experience my accidental introduction to social engagement, and now much of my work has a participatory or co-creative element. When I first realized that the knitting and stitching skills I took for granted were readily transferable to making art, I think I knew intuitively that using these processes in unexpected ways would make people think. Knitting and stitch both have clear associations with comfort, garments, and the body. The feminist art historian, Rosika Parker, in her book, The Subversive Stitch, suggests that the stereotypical expectations of knitting and stitch are that they should be private, functional, decorative, clean, safe, benign, perfect, and finished. My work subverts those expectations. It's intentionally sloppy craft, made and displayed in public, often unfinished and left to unravel. Made using skin-like materials and rough gestural stitches, my work is troubling and emotive, with an undercurrent of dark humour. I like to call it the dark side of stitch. According to Rosika Parker, cloth itself is a gendered material. She suggests that there are various femininities associated with cloth, which have potential for adding further subversive meanings. She proposes that cloth is a signifier of the private, and thus feminine sphere. She describes the gender divide between high art and feminized craft, and suggests that fine art was established as a public activity of high status, associated with male professionals, while embroidery became a low-status craft, associated predominantly with women and domestic spaces. The links between embroidery and cloth are clear. Judy Atfield, design historian, also discusses the private nature of cloth by proposing that because clothes make direct contact with the body and domestic furnishings define the personal spaces inhabited by the body, cloth is proposed as one of the most intimate things that materializes the connection between the body and the outer world. During my recent MA at Bath Spa, my research was focused on ways to visualize the boundaries between a number of binaries: self and other, embodiment, disembodiment, form, formlessness, absence, presence, order, disorder, public and private, amongst others, and ultimately, actually, life and death. I was subsequently very interested when I discovered that the anthropologist Mary Douglas suggests that boundaries provide certainty. Considering them as thresholds acknowledges them as flexible, which leads to disquiet and a range of conflicting responses. It was like a eureka moment in a way. I now realize that the ambiguity in my work is the main reason that people respond to it in so many different and conflicting ways. Douglas goes on to say that this ambivalence prompts not only danger, but also power. This is again about balance and the tension of opposites, which also seems to amplify the transgressive aspects of my work. Douglas goes on to say, anomalous and ambiguous things are often seen as disgusting, disruptive, and dangerous. However, these are not the only possible reactions. There's a whole gradient on which laughter, revulsion, and shock belong at different points and intensities, according to the type of transgression. The abject describes a different kind of blurring of boundaries. The French philosopher Julia Kristeva describes it as the human reaction, horror, vomit, to a threatened breakdown in meaning caused by the loss of the distinction between subject and object, or between self and other. One example is the feeling of revulsion you get when you find hair in your food, even when you know it's your own. Kristeva says that death is the ultimate in abjection. Associated with this is what Freud describes as the uncanny. When something is familiar and yet not quite as it seems. He suggests that humans have a basic urge to avoid death, to become immortal, which makes us attempt to replicate ourselves. As artists, that can obviously be through self-portraiture. He claims, however, that often the double we've so carefully created reverses its aspect. From having been an assurance of immortality, it becomes the uncanny harbinger of death. He also talks about castration and body parts, which obviously resonates with my work as well. Much of my work also has aspects of the sublime within it. Anneliese Baird makes connections between the abject, the uncanny, and the sublime, all of which, she suggests, are concerned with the destabilization of boundaries. She says, the sublime is also connected to the blurring of boundaries and the paradox and ambiguity this produces. The resulting feeling is paradoxical itself, aptly named. Pleasant terror and delightful horror. Like the abject and the uncanny, the sublime causes uneasiness and confusion in destabilizing the boundaries created by human beings to make sense of the world. Mary Douglas also talks about order and disorder. She describes dirt as matter out of place. It's about context, obviously. So shoes on the table are dirty. On the shoe rack, they're fine. She goes on to say that things may come to be out of place by being anomalous or ambiguous. Installing art in unexpected places, I think, can also provoke conflicting responses, as in some ways it becomes matter out of place. Each situation adds meaning, and the works maybe become more accessible to people who wouldn't normally engage with art, but it can also make people uncomfortable. Choosing to hang my work increases the sense of ambivalence. One of my favourite artists, Louise Bourgeois, asserts that hanging and floating are states of ambivalence and doubt, and that the hanging thing is very helpless, fragile, and vulnerable. Phila de Barlow says that suspending work creates very different identities for the sculpture, suggesting a kind of displacement. Unstuffed bodily sculptures pierced with meat hooks and hanging from chains. All of these things also add to the feeling of absence, loss, and abjection. Returning to Jung's individuation and the idea of balancing multiple selves, much of my work deals in multiples. It's fragmented, deconstructed, shape-shifting, precarious, unraveling, balanced between form and formlessness. The artist Annette Messager often works in multiples too, referencing multiple identities. She says, "I work by accumulation to hide myself," and that her works incorporate ambivalence, the representation of bodies, often fragmented. She also makes large-scale immersive installations, often including parts, some of which are made by her and some which are everyday found objects. She assembles them in unexpected ways, so that, as she says, the work oscillates between lightness and gravity. I see many similarities between her work and mine: the multiples, the methods of installations, the abstract body parts, but most of all, the use of ambivalence to provoke conflicting responses. Thinking more about materiality and meaning, there are so many reasons why I choose to work predominantly with knitting and stitch. Cloth is an unconventional medium in fine art, which adds to the meaning it conveys. Although I have noticed with glee that it's actually being more accepted in major art galleries around the UK anyway at the moment, which is very exciting for me. Traditionally, hard, durable materials like stone, marble, and bronze have been used for sculpture. The soft, impermanent nature of cloth, however, evokes the human form and its mortality, revealing alternative meanings in its folds and surfaces, and taking on a bodily resonance. Cloth can also be regarded as a second skin. Curator and researcher in contemporary textiles, Pernina Barnett, suggests that there's a merging of the senses of touch and sight associated with cloth. She says, "The eye does not simply look, it also feels. Its response is both visual and tactile. The senses are each enfolded in the other." Catherine Dormer, professor of textile practices and feminisms, also suggests that the materiality and skin-like nature of cloth provides an alternative range of meanings. Operating both through touch and sight simultaneously, the two modes of perception provide differing points of access to the viewer. I've been greatly influenced by the work and words of Louise Bourgeois, maybe predictably, and maybe especially in her use of cloth. Art historian Linda Nochlin calls Bourgeois' stitched work grotesque handiwork and the deliberate ferocity of bad sewing, which, she says, challenges the gendered expectations of work with cloth. Bourgeois herself says many, many delightful things, and one of my favourites is, "The act of sewing is a process of emotional repair." I was delighted during my MA, I think, maybe, to find that there's actually some scholarly work written about so-called sloppy craft. Patterson and Surette's book of the same name, published in 2015, describes a relatively recent acknowledgement of a movement amongst craft practitioners and fine artists to use traditional craft skills without what they call the expected refined skill, mastery of technique, and a striving for perfection. The essays in the book discuss how unkempt and haphazard ways of working can add conceptual meaning. The artist Anne Wilson, who first coined the term in 2007, maintains that sloppy is the antithesis to what good craft should be. She goes on to say that combining the words sloppy and craft sets up a binary of opposites that defies and possibly flips established hierarchies of value. She describes the ubiquity of computer screens, digital media, and the availability of seemingly easy perfection that demands an opposite. She suggests that there's a desire for a more sensorial experience, materiality, and the mark of the hand, with the consequent foible and imperfection, irregularity, and uncertainty. Much of my work is intentionally sloppy and unfinished, like this knitted installation, Red is the Colour of, a series of 40 hand-knitted sculptures which have been left to unravel. I was, of course, absolutely delighted that this piece was selected for New Contemporaries 2022. It was an interesting thing how the curators were very anxious about the fact that it would continue to unravel as they were handling it. But I find that that is just part of the work. If it comes to be unraveled entirely, I will remake it. During my MA, I also worked with other materials with very different meanings. My final MA exhibition was an assemblage of knitted and stitched sculptures with cast concrete and lead body parts, connected with precarious articulated steel frames. Combining these different materials sets up interesting contrasts, I think. Traditional alongside the unconventional, hard versus soft, masculine versus feminine, bodily, industrial, and others. I favour slow, labour-intensive, repetitive processes like knitting and stitch, so it's been good for me to learn similar but new slow processes working with metal and casting. The mark of my hand in my work has always been important to me, but I recognise that my making is becoming increasingly performative. The traces of my whole body are now evident in my work. During my MA, I started synthesizing two different kinds of performance into my sculptures. I used the poses from my videoed performances and made them into life-size steel sculptures using the form and force of my body, measuring, cutting, bending, clamping, welding. I saw it as a kind of performative drawing. Studying and making art has certainly become an extremely powerful way for me to explore my own identity, myself. It also helps me to understand and make connections with people who are very different from me, the other. Investigating issues which are hard to talk about through my art helps me to process them, but also prompts others to think about them too. It's really about exploring common ground together, but also about celebrating difference. Dr. Sami Scholk, Associate Professor of Gender and Women's Studies, says, "The binary of self and other is perhaps one of the most basic theories of human consciousness and identity, claiming in short that the existence of an other, a not self, allows the possibility or recognition of a self." She goes on to say, "In other words, I see you. I do not control your body or hear your thoughts. You are separate, you are not me. Therefore, I am me." The self-other binary seemed to be an accepted division of how the modern individual comprehends who she, he, they are by recognizing what she, he, they are not. And returning to Jung, he says that individuation is dependent upon relationships with others. He says, "The self is relatedness. The self only exists inasmuch as you appear, not that you are, but that you do the self. The self appears in your deeds, and deeds always mean relationship." I've called this presentation Self and Other, as increasingly I feel that exploring the similarities and differences between myself or selves and others, and the connections between us, is fundamental to my art practice. But of course, there is a darker side. Claire Bishop says, "The presence of what is not me renders my identity precarious. The threat that the other represents transforms my own sense of self into something questionable." My work explores this space between us, both physically and metaphorically. Some of you may recognise the participant in this particular image. And it was actually a very, very cold day at Locksbrook. And this particular lovely person asked if she could borrow one of my body cocoons because she was so cold. So that's a little story behind this one. I find inspiration in many places, as well as being inspired by other artists, by philosophy, psychology, anthropology. I also find inspiration in literature. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, for example, is the very moving story of Dr. Frankenstein, who attempts to create a living being, but subsequently utterly rejects his grotesque creation. Much has been written about otherness in Frankenstein. The Doctor and his creature are both aspects of ourselves, all ourselves. They both speak to us about being human, the creator and the created. If you haven't read the book, do consider reading it. In my opinion, it doesn't bear much resemblance to the stereotypical film versions, which tend to focus on the created rather than the creator. Dr. Frankenstein's story resonates strongly with me. His obsession, the joining of parts, the labour and the time spent, the bringing to life, and finally the othering of the created by the creator. My sculptures are uncanny, abject in many ways, yet also vulnerable and strangely alluring. I sometimes call them my Frankenstein's monsters. Guillermo del Toro, director of the film The Shape of Water, thanked Mary Shelley, saying that she gave voice to the voiceless and presence to the invisible. Sometimes we talk about monsters. Sometimes to talk about monsters, we need to fabricate monsters of our own, and parables, and I add, or art, can do that for us. And here's another of my Frankenstein's monsters. My work embodies ideas, giving them a physical form, making them visible. Artist Nathaniel Stern describes embodiment as moving, thinking, feeling. He talks about the feedback loops between sensation, experience, movement, and understanding. This, I feel, describes my practice well. There are clear connections between Nick Cave's sound suits and my body cocoons. His wearable sculptures investigate identity as well, explicitly in terms of gender, race, and cultural heritage. He says, inside a suit, you couldn't tell if I was a woman or a man, if I was black, red, green, or orange, from Haiti or South Africa. I was no longer Nick. I was a shaman of sorts. I especially like the fact that Cave has made about 600 sound suits so far. I can completely relate to that obsession. Although he obviously has more than one idea too, he is clearly still enjoying exploring identity. My body cocoons explore identity as well. I actually only have 5 of these, but my wearable sculptures are growing apace. I haven't actually counted them recently. They do explore identity, but in my own particular way. When they're worn by me, they take on my form and explore the boundaries between self and other, private and public. I started knitting this one the day that the first lockdown happened in England, and I spent more time knitting, I think, during that period than I normally would. Obviously, we were all at home, and I was partway through my MA, so this became part of my master's assessment in the end. For that first year, I did it part-time. I think this was one weekend we found an empty wood, and of course I had to do a private performance in it. I think there's something shamanistic about them, especially when they're situated in unexpected places. And here's another one. There are elements of apparition in my work too, I think, suggesting fantasy and ritual, dreams or nightmares. I'm playing with the spaces between binaries again, reality, unreality, presence, absence, embodiment, disembodiment. If you go down to the woods today. Marcus Coates plays with boundaries too, and often uses ritual to frame his work, exploring what he calls a relationship to the unknowable and taking on the role of shaman. His work has been described as a self-portrait, and that's how I see mine. His work connects social engagements and performance with objects as well. Art Monthly says that his work manages to be both bizarrely ridiculous, yet poignant, a source of estrangement and disorientation, but equally of fascination and delight. I absolutely love these photos, the sandwiches. My wishing trees during the COVID-19 lockdowns were very different to Marcus Coates's work, but I think they also synthesized a socially distanced social engagement with performance, with objects, ritual, and connection, although, of course, that also had to be at a distance or online. I feel as if I have actually talked a lot about the darker side of my practice. So what about the brighter side? The wishing trees were, well, they became an astonishing project for me personally, but I think also they meant a lot to many other people in Bristol. I planted 4 participatory installations on 4 trees in public spaces in Bristol, just as the lockdown started in 2020. And I invited passers-by to bring something to add next time they walked that way on their daily outing. The trees were transformed over time as people brought objects and messages to add to the growing installations. I couldn't leave materials for them because of contamination anxiety, so the range of things that people added was utterly delightful. This is just a very small part of it. It was an astonishing experience. I was interested, though, in the idea of the ritual of bringing in objects and performative actions, writing, walking, tying, reading, tending, and connecting. I think I like to say that there was actually a 5th wishing tree that was online, because within a day of setting up the first wishing tree outside my house here in Bristol, I started to have messages from around the world on Instagram, particularly, from people saying, would I add this particular message to the tree? So I spent quite a lot of time connecting with people through social media about the wishing tree. And I feel as if I have a sort of virtual community there, which I'm so grateful for. And the wishing trees became a symbol of hope and connectedness for many people, including myself, at an extremely hopeless and disconnected time. Natasha's already mentioned, but as well as social engagement, another bright aspect of my practice is having the opportunity to work with other artists. I'm extremely grateful to be part of these 2 art collectives, Social Scaffolding and Seam Collective. In fact, many of, all of Social Scaffolding, all 3 of us were Bath Spa graduates, and many of the Seam Collective are also Bath Spa graduates, interestingly. It can be rather solitary being an artist, especially after being part of a university cohort. It's hard to cope with the constant need to apply for opportunities and funding all by yourself, and of course the subsequent and ongoing rejections. I call it a roller coaster, highs and lows, and it's difficult when you're working alone. But working with other artists is wonderful for mutual support and solidarity, and actually it's just much more fun. This year has been astonishing, though, as both collectives were awarded Arts Council funding for 2 separate, simultaneous, and very different touring exhibitions. It's consequently been an extremely busy year for me and very hard work. But one of the best things about touring has been having opportunities to develop new work, but also, and probably most importantly for me, to spend time with all these lovely people. And if any of you are interested, Seam Collective is currently exhibiting at Sherborne Girls' School and has another 2 exhibitions coming up this year, one in Cwmbran and one in Honiton. So if you're interested, have a look at my website, Instagram, probably. That's probably the most reliable and up-to-date place to find out information. The Social Scaffolding Tour has given me the opportunity to develop my social knitwork installation. Lots of socials, social scaffolding and social knitwork. I set up a series of den-like spaces with netting, site responsively, in 6 empty shops in busy shopping centres. I absolutely loved this part of the setup. For me, every time it was like sculpting or drawing with netting. I had to be really adaptable, respond to what was there in the space. I discovered all sorts of interesting ways to hang things in places that were difficult. I think the hardest one actually was Bristol because the ceiling was so high. But I find it thrilling to see how the installation changes in each space as it's different every time. Again, that shape-shifting, the shape-shifting nature of textiles, I find so interesting. It shape-shifts as we wear it, it shape-shifts as we hang it, it drapes. Well, very interesting. Well, I'm a bit obsessed, if one can be a bit obsessed. Another thing about textiles, of course, is touch. Normally in an art gallery, there's signs saying, please don't touch. What happens if you invite visitors not only to touch, but to make or even wear the art? The Social Scaffolding Tour has enabled me to research these ideas by inviting passive viewers to become active participant performers, and the work has been wonderfully animated by their presence. It was so joyous, honestly. The biggest joy for me has been working alongside our visitors during social scaffolding, making objects to add to the installation. Research shows that making is good for us, but making with others prompts delightful connection, conversation, and a sense of community, and lots of laughter. And who would have thought that together, over 9 months, we made many, many, many pom-poms. Juliet, Alison, and myself were discussing the other day how many pom-poms we think have gone out into the world, like a pom-pom revolution. I feel quite sad that we didn't think to count how many were made. I have the ones still that were added to the net, but most people took theirs away with them as a little bit of fluffy, brightly coloured joy. But we'll never know, and it doesn't really matter. But we did make many, many, many pom-poms. As the tour proceeded, the netting den became denser and denser in each venue as visitors added their contributions. Strips of cloth, knitting, pom-poms, of course, and labels. Social knitwork was transformed. In Social Scaffolding's first venue in Shepton Mallet, the transformation was most visible, of course, as the space changed considerably through co-creation in just 12 days. From there, it went to the next, as it was, the netting full of objects and messages was moved. I moved it to the next space and on and on. It became harder and harder to set it up, but it kept changing and growing, and it's been very thrilling to be part of it. For Social Scaffolding, I was also able to trial a commissioned video booth app. Finally, I was able to invite visitors to wear my body cocoons, which I had to knit for myself during lockdown, but here I could finally invite others to wear them. And I had a little setup with an iPad on the wall where visitors were invited to video themselves wearing some of my knitted sculptures, and then those videos would end up on the very large, the sort of human-sized screen. Participants became performers, living sculptures. I loved seeing how wearing the sculptures gave people freedom to move in such different ways. There was much joy and laughter. Adding technology definitely added another dimension to my living sculptures. And the feedback from our visitors has been delightful. There are lots of, again, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of messages about comfort and nests and dens and fun and happy places. And these are some of just a relatively random selection. I'm always quite pleased when there's still that ambivalence. So here one says, it's cool but creepy. And another one says, it looks like Stranger Things. So alongside the fun exploration, childhood and laughter, alongside the idea of being in a nest, and I really enjoy that ambivalence in responses. It's been a wonderful privilege to have the opportunity to explore different ways to make fine art accessible to audiences who might not normally be interested in art, engaging visitors through touch, co-creation and performance, all in unexpected places, in shopping centres, in the Southwest, in small towns. This project has definitely provoked thought, conversation, and action. Challenging myself to be more sustainable. For Seam Collective's A Visible Thread exhibition, I've developed some new sculptures. This series, Transitional Objects, was made with my late parents' used clothes, bedding, and towels, and parts of some of my old sculptures. They're highly textured, chimeras. Inviting visitors to touch these alluring yet uncanny sculptures has again provoked an interesting range of conflicting responses. Comfort and intimacy, but also some discomfort and objection. And needless to say, the people who are not so comfortable also didn't want a photo. Again, continuing to think about ways to use recycled materials, I knitted a sculpture using someone else's mother's stash of mixed yarns. I was intrigued by the change in control and randomness brought about by using such a mixture of yarn that someone else had chosen for another purpose. And obviously, as ever with my work, stash is also wearable and a shapeshifter. Another bright aspect of my practice is my knitting. For me, the process of knitting is as important as the product. I knit whenever and wherever I can. I did wonder whether I'd be able to knit while I was talking, but actually I have had to concentrate on the talk, so I haven't been knitting. Hey ho, later. Knitting in private is what I call my stream of consciousness knitting. I have no pattern, just a few rules which I sometimes allow myself to break. I make decisions as I knit, and the form develops intuitively. I very quickly enter a state of meditative timelessness, which induces a profound sense of well-being. The psychologist Csikszentmihalyi describes this as the state of flow. It's caused by deep concentration, where levels of skill match levels of challenge. It's often linked to creativity and ultimately to happiness. I see it, in a way, as a kind of therapy. I'm sure you'll recognise this in many of the art processes you use. Knitting in public, however, is like a people catcher. Strangers can't help talking to me. It really does become a social network. And what about performance? I'm a reluctant performer, actually, but I see performative elements throughout my practice, my knitting in public, my solitary performances during lockdown. Even installing my work, I think, is performative. And of course, the mark of my body in my making. I'm becoming more and more conscious of the critical role that I play in my participatory works too. There's definitely a performative aspect to it. It's utterly genuine, I have to say, and building relationships is key. Again, making connections between self and other. I also invite others to become participants, performers, of course. And more about self and other. I'm definitely an introvert, but I need people too. I've just finished a wonderful year's residency at Bath Spa University's graduate scheme Emerge. I believe there's some people from Emerge here today, which it has just been wonderful. I'm so grateful to everyone there for your support. And I'm so glad that I can still be a collective member, although what that will be, I'm not quite sure yet. If you're studying at Bath Spa at the moment, do consider applying to Emerge. It's a wonderfully supportive community of creatives. I'm now partway through my Dreamtime Fellowship at Spike Island in Bristol, where I live. I started in October when I was still touring with Social Scaffolding. So it's really has been since before Christmas, just before Christmas, that I was able actually to be there as much as I'd like to be. It's a year's residency with a shared studio with 4 other, they call us fellows, which seems a bit odd, but anyway, 4 other fellows, 3 from UWE and 1 from Bath Spa. So we share a studio, and it's for me, my Dreamtime Fellowship is sponsored by the artist Luke Jerram. You may have seen his big inflatable moons and the water slide on Park Street. So I'm so thrilled. It includes mentoring with Luke, membership of the Spike Associates community, access to fabrication facilities there, and some funding. But the best thing for me, actually always, is the community. I'm currently developing new work for a commission for the Light Night Festival in Worcester in February with another artist, Ollie Bliss. We've worked together before as Baker and Bliss, and we facilitate playful participatory art installations, particularly which explore queer and subversive stitch. For Light Night, we're constructing a large-scale walk-through glow-in-the-dark immersive installation made with used textiles. It'll be in an empty shop in Worcester Town Centre for the week leading up to the festival, and we'll be inviting our visitors to make queer and subversive objects with used clothing to add to the glowing and growing installation. Come and join us. This photo is just a trial. I was trying out a few things. I've knitted some glow-in-the-dark sculptures, and they're hanging in front of some psychedelic patterns that I've spray painted on old duvet covers. It's definitely part of the brighter side of my practice, and it's really, really good for me to be developing new work. Through the careful synthesis of material, process, form, colour, surface and installation, combined always with people, places, concept and critical thought, I attempt to communicate complex ideas. It's as if I'm knitting together key aspects of my research, even when there's no knitting involved. And finally, returning to the idea of self and other, I'm very grateful that through my art I can explore not only my own identity, myself, myselves, but also connect with the other, visitors, participants, and other artists, balancing the darker side of my practice with the brighter side. Thank you to everyone who's been part of my art adventure so far. And thank you for listening.
Well, thanks very much, Lou. That was really generous talk, and it was lovely to kind of offer some of the kind of wisdom about the journey that you've taken since leaving Bath and the brilliant fellowships and the brilliant Emerge. So a real kind of really great for our students to hear all about those opportunities. Are you still there, Lou, or have you frozen? Oh, I think we might have lost Lou.
Here I am.
Oh, she's back.
Back, but maybe not my video. I think I accidentally left the meeting. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. That was brilliant. You missed me saying how brilliant you were. Thank you so much for that generous talk for everybody. I know there's people from outside our student community, and I know everyone. I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as I did. What I loved was actually hearing you like talk about those opportunities like Emerge, like and the Spike Fellowship, and there's so many of those opportunities, and it's really always lovely to hear about how to be generous about them to the students. Who some of our third years are taking that kind of daunting step into the world, and with the degree shows looming, they're all in the middle of their assessments. So thanks for that, Lou. And I'm conscious of time because it's 6 o'clock and it's very dark outside. But if anyone has got any questions, you can pop them in the chat, or you can just open your mic and ask. I actually, mine isn't really a question, but I was suddenly got quite struck by language or words, and how this talk was very structured, and you map theory and you're reading, and then I was thinking about, knitting and stitch as words or a language. I was thinking about the relevance of language, I think, but it's probably not a question and not an easy thing to answer, but I was just interested in the way, the relevance of language in a way to the practice. But ignore that question. Let's see if anyone.
Well, I actually think that's a really interesting thing, and I agree. I think it's quite hard to answer, but for me, language is critical. Words are so important to me. So the sort of written research and the words that I use, the words that people use when I write, when I read, are very, very important to me. And I also think the language of textiles, as you were intimating, is a very interesting thing. How it is sort of ingrained in our culture, in our culture, and I'm sure it will be around the world as well. Interesting.
Yeah, I was thinking it also just, like maybe also because we've been looking at third year presentations today, and I was thinking about, you've structured that talk very, and you weave in a way the kind of thinking of others, and then I was thinking also that's the tone. There's a kind of rhythm and a tone and a pace. And then I was thinking about the clicking of knitting needles and then that, I've got increasingly interested in those kind of flow spaces that
absolutely
in terms of making. And so there was just something really lovely about that, the talk and how that really came to the surface. Anyway,
thank you.
No, it's really great. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm knitting now.
Brilliant. I'm not, because I'm absolutely terrible at it. But has anyone else got any questions before I say thanks and let everyone go? Is any questions out there? Anyone want to open their mic and ask a question, or drop a question into the chat? Also, we can just go up to Emerge. Can we come? Do you still hang out at Emerge, or are you actually now?
I'm now a collective member, which means I don't have a space there, but I am based at, so I'm predominantly based at Spike Island. I couldn't really do both. I didn't think, because I live in Bristol, I think it would be too difficult for me to be half in Bath and half in Bristol. But I miss my Emerge buddies, and I will still keep connecting. And if anyone in this talk, if you want to be in touch, please do. Email me, send me a message, ask me a question.
Yeah, Instagram. I presume Instagram's a good place to do that as well.
Instagram's a really good place. I've got a website. I've got a couple of websites. You can contact me through those. My email address is on my Instagram, I think, if you prefer email. But I'm very open to making connections.
Brilliant. And then the other thing that might be really helpful, actually, Lou, is that it would be lovely. I'm conscious that there was quite a lot of references in the talk. So actually, I don't know whether you would be kind enough to kind of share some of that list of references, so that the students can. So if you can always email me or Simone, who helped organise this, with that list of references, and we'll share it with the students, because there was a real rich list for everyone, and some great bits of reading, I'm sure.
Yes, I will do that with great pleasure.
Okay, well, it's brilliant to see some our new faces and old faces in the audience. So of students from that I've taught, and great to see people from the wider community. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thanks especially to you, Lou. What a brilliant talk, and
thank you.
And enjoy the rest of the evening knitting. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lou. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.